Today we explain to you why most of the Bakugo, the second user of One For All, time travel theories don't make sense, but at the same time we are going to show you our own version of the time travel theory. We do this by showing you different ways of time travel in My Hero Academia, then we will eliminate the versions that are not possible, and in the end we will explain our own version of this theory. My Hero Academia, Bakugo from the future, here in Yunami. Also, only a small percentage of the people who watch our videos are actually subscribed, so if you end up liking this video, consider subscribing. Please enjoy this video. Let's go. Before we begin, in no way do we try to discredit those who came up with this theory, but simply point out our problem that we see with these time travel theories. And at the end of this video, we will show you our very own version of this theory and explain why we believe our theory is more likely than the one you have heard so far. First of all, there are many versions of the time travel interpretation. The idea that there is a time loop where Bakugo is always the second user of One For All, or that Bakugo simply traveled back in time to change the past, is just one of many possible theories. To really decide which of these theories is most likely, we need to eliminate as many of these theories as possible while focusing on what we already know. Hence, we need to look at the behavior and circumstances of the second user of One For All and Bakugo to understand their coexistence and consequently what specific time travel interpretation Horikoshi is using for My Hero Academia. There are several ways how time travel and its related causalities can affect time. Usually in time travel stories, it's about the main character being involved in time travel, or at least we readers are aware that time travel takes place in the plot, which means that we already know that time travel exists, and based on the events and the causality that occur due to time travel, we understand the rules of time travel in this specific story. As in Back to the Future, for example, there's only one timeline. Going back in time and changing something will directly change the entire future, to the point where you may even stop existing if you did something in the past that endangered your own existence in the present. Another possibility is the version used in Dragon Ball, in which Trunks traveled back in time, but anything he changed doesn't change the future he came from, because there are multiple timelines. Or for example the Harry Potter time travel, where you travel into the past only to discover that time travel is an endless loop, in which there are an infinite number of versions of yourself that have traveled before you. You can't change the past because it has already happened, and any time travel has always been part of time itself. But in My Hero Academia, we only have the bare idea that Bakugo might have traveled back in time from the future without us even knowing the circumstances of the future, which makes it impossible to follow the rules of time travel in My Hero Academia universe, and therefore it is very difficult to make reliable predictions. Here are just one of the few most common versions of all the hundreds of possible time travel interpretations. One of them is most likely used in My Hero Academia. Knowing which of these is used, we can understand the reason Bakugo went back in time. Remember that some theorems have two concepts, either with a single timeline, which means that changing the past creates a new future, which is the only future for all people at all points of the timeline, and there's also the concept of multiple timelines, where changing the past only creates a new timeline but does not affect the timeline from which the time traveler originated. One of the most popular versions is that Bakugo goes back to the past, and the young Bakugo from the past, or our present in My Hero Academia, does everything exactly as the Bakugo from the future did before he went to the past. This is because the future is already set in stone, and the only reason the future Bakugo has traveled back in time is because he has to go back in time to keep up with the timeline. This would be the case, for example, if Deku told Bakugo that he is the second user of One For All and also the one who told the first user how to pass on One For All. Bakugo will then understand that he must do the same, otherwise the present time will change, and therefore Bakugo is forced to go back in time. This version is rather unlikely, as the second user doubted that Deku is the right person for One For All, which means that Deku was not a user of One For All in the future from which the second user came from, and therefore there can be no time loop in which Bakugo is always the second user of One For All. Every time Bakugo has to travel back in time to teach the first user how to use One For All, completely new and random people could be chosen to be one of the successors of One For All, which means there are infinite possibilities, and if only one of these loops fails, then All For One wins. So if there are infinite loops with infinite possibilities, it is only a matter of time before one of those loops fails, and with it all future loops are stopped. So a time loop is definitely not an option. This means all theories that say Bakugo went back in time because he was always the second user of One For All and history repeats itself over and over again are simply impossible, or at least very unlikely. Theoretically it is possible, but in our opinion it is rather very difficult. Before my partner continues, if you already enjoyed this video, please leave a like. This would help us a lot. You see, the research for this video was a big pain in the ass, so a little like would be really appreciated. With your help we can do more and better content for you. And if you are new, subscribe to our channel with the notification bell activated. We make weekly My Hero Academia content, reviews and theories.
Another possibility is that future Bakugo thinks that he's going back in time for the first time, only to discover that all his actions are determined by what his future version has already done before him. An endless loop, which is exactly the same of what he's doing now, which means that he's laying the foundation that will force the present Bakugo to go on the same way and thereby force his younger self to do the same, and so on, an endless loop. Just to give you a random example, imagine that Deku will never tell Bakugo that his future version traveled back in time and was the second user for One For All. And imagine that at some point in the future, Bakugo will fight a villain who has the quirk of time travel. This villain sends Bakugo into the past. Having landed in the past, he suddenly begins to realize that all the actions he's doing in the past unintentionally lead to the victory against All For One. For example, it happens that he met the first user for One For All and finds out that the first user does not even know how to pass the quirk and thus forced to become his second user. This version is also impossible for the same reason as already mentioned. The second user did not recognize Deku as one of the users of One For All from his future. And the simplest version is that Bakugo travels back in time from a future, but everything he does is not going to change the timeline from which he came from, but simply create a new one. However, we prefer only one timeline rather than multiple. And the final time travel theorem is the version we support. Namely, the very act of going back in time creates an entirely new timeline, where the old timeline no longer exists. In this version, from a casual point of view, everything Bakugo does in the past changes the course of history into a new timeline. And with that, Bakugo from the present can have a different future from his future self, which has traveled back into the past. In this case, if Bakugo comes from a time when the heroes lost to All For One, and now he wants to change the past for a better future. And that brings us to what we think happened. If the second user of One For All is really Bakugo from the future, then we believe that the future Bakugo comes from a different timeline in which Deku never received One For All, which would perfectly explain why the second user were initially so hostile to the idea of Deku becoming the next user. It looks like the second user for One For All doesn't know what's going on in the current timeline and whether they'll even be able to defeat All For One. According to this logic, it makes all theories in which Bakugo is in a constant time loop simply impossible. This means that there is only one timeline without loops, from which Bakugo has traveled from the future to the past, erasing the future and trying to create a new future. He does this by becoming the second user and then trying to replace all the wrong users for One For All from his future with the right people. It would explain why the second and the third users have such a small age difference. It seems like Bakugo received One For All just so he could immediately pass it to someone he believed has a good and useful quirk, and then told him to pass the quirk right away too to someone who has a good quirk. Thus the fourth user received One For All and then spent the next 18 years cultivating One For All so that his successors would have a better chance of defeating All For One. Let us know in the comments below what you believe about all these time travel mess. Do you believe that our version is the correct one? And what version you believe might be true? So that's it for today, folks. Hope you guys enjoyed our video, and if you did, don't forget to smash the like button, and if you are new to our channel, make sure you subscribe with the notification bell turned on. See you guys in the next video. Yummy out.